I'm just gonna start the recording. For today, we have with us Gary Francione, whose abolitionist theory of animal rights has been groundbreaking in the way we think about animals. He is Board of Governors, Distinguished Professor of Law, and uh, Katzenbach Scholar of Law and Philosophy at Rutgers University Law School. He is also visiting professor of philosophy at University of Lincoln and honorary professor of philosophy at University of East Anglia. We are here today to discuss his new book, which just came out in April, called Why Veganism Matters: The Moral Value of Animals. Um, Please feel free to ask a question to Gary at any point. Just unmute yourself or raise a hand using the Zoom function, or put the question in the chat box. But at the same time, please mute yourself while if you're not asking a question or if you're not speaking. Gary, I thought we could start with the wonderful dedication of your book, which is closely connected to the central argument you're making in the book. For those of you who missed that, it says, I have it here, dedicated to all of those who believe that animals matter morally, but who are not yet vegans. There are so many of you that, were you to embrace veganism, we could bring about a revolution of the heart and change the world for non-human animals. I thought maybe, Gary, you could introduce your book a little bit, and talk about this dedication, because it's a bit of a contrast to the rest of the book, where you're saying that there is this moral imperative, and that if you believe that this is so, then this is how you would have to treat the animal.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, thank you for having me. I think that it's totally consistent in the sense that what I'm arguing is that we have a very peculiar movement, in that we've got an animal movement where people claim to believe that animals matter morally, but many of them continue to eat animals. And indeed, the movement takes the position that, I mean, it promotes ideas like compassionate exploitation or compassionate consumption. Indeed, the person who's referred to as the father of the animal rights movement, Peter Singer, who, of course, being utilitarian, is not involved with rights at all, does not endorse moral rights at all, talks about being a flexible vegan. He talks about compassionate, compassionate consumption, things like that, and um, and I think that's very peculiar. My view is, if animals matter, you can't treat them as things. Whatever else whatever other imperatives there are, you can't treat them as things. That means you can't eat them, you can't wear them, you can't use them. You cannot treat them as things in any way that you would reject treating humans as things. And since I mean, we can all disagree, or many people disagree, about what constitutes discrimination against humans. We all agree that chattel slavery is wrong. And so even if there are disputes about whether particular practices are discriminatory or not discriminatory, nobody, at least openly, although perhaps in the United States, the Republican Party is starting to move closer to this, I don't know. But nobody openly endorses chattel slavery. And so, but that's what animals are. They're property. And that's why we are allowed to kill them, to eat them, to wear them, to use them for all sorts of purposes, entertainment purposes, to put into cosmetics or shampoos or whatever, to use them for sport hunting, to use them for research. The reason why we're able to do that is because they're things, they're property. And so what I try to do in the book is to say, look, if you think animals matter, then you got to stop eating them, wearing them, using them. Whatever other obligations you have, you got to stop eating them, wearing them, using them. End of story. And that this idea that we can continue to exploit them, or that veganism isn't a moral imperative, is something which just bewilders me, to be frank. And so my view is look, if you take all the people in the world that claim to be concerned about animals, um, and they become vegan, the world changes immediately. And you know, that's what we need. You know, we need clarity on this. If animals matter, you can't continue to exploit them. That's something I do not understand. I have never, in the years I've been doing this, and you know, I started doing this in the 1980s, and the abolitionist, I started developing the abolitionist approach in the 1980s. I was working then with Tom Reagan, very closely with a guy named Tom Reagan, who wrote a book called Case for Animal Rights. And he and I worked very, very closely for a number of years. And as a matter of fact, if you're interested in that, I've written an article about the early days with Tom and I, when Tom and I were working together and what we were thinking about. But I'll be happy to give you the citation to that if you want it. But I really believe talking about loving animals or caring about animals and eating them, which is the main way. I mean, you know, we can talk about everything else. I generally talk about veganism is not just eating them, you know, not eating them. It's not eating them, wearing them, using them. But I generally talk about diet because in my experience, nothing changes until you stop eating them. Once you stop eating them for moral reasons, then everything sort of falls into place. But the thing you got to really get to people about is eating them. And my view is that talking about regarding animals as having moral value while you continue to eat them is like saying, well, you know, I love my partner, but I beat her or something. I mean, it makes no sense to me. It makes no sense whatsoever to me. And so that's what the book is about. And that's what the book is about. In any event, so I don't know if I answered that. That was probably a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but that's
So
so it
it's
gives you.
really interesting. You know, you talk about this strange attitude that we have towards animals, and I was reminded of Cora Diamond's beautiful essay where she talks about this difficulty of reality, and I think I saw her name in your acknowledgements section as well. And she talks about this difficulty of reality that we have when we are trying to think about animals, why we treat them that way, why we say we care about them, but we still don't mind doing the things to them that we do. And when you're talking about this kind of strange, bewildering attitude that we have towards animals, where exactly do you locate that strangeness? Is it, as Diamond would say, something to do with the difficulty of reality itself, or is it in a single attitude where we think that animals are property or that they are quasi persons, or is it something else?
Well, I've known Cora Diamond for many years. As a matter of fact, when I was in graduate school, I was her assistant in her philosophy of religion class.
Oh, wow.
I yes, and as a matter of fact, I I've known Cora for a long, long time, and and I think it comes from the fact that I don't think it's that complicated. I think that there's a very easy answer. In the 19th century, at least in the West, and I'm confining this to the West because in many ways the East was different in large part because of the religious traditions there. So you had different thinking about ways more advanced thinking in the East, and but different thinking than you had in the West. In the West, animals were basically excluded completely from the moral and legal community. They were things, they were chattel, they were property. What happens in the 19th century is that there's a shift in that people start recognizing, well, that animals are sentient, they have interests, they're property, but they have interests, and that we have a moral obligation to treat them humanely, to take their suffering into consideration and to mitigate that suffering as much as we can. And that's a moral obligation that we owe directly to animals. And the problem is that we bifurcated, and this is the really interesting thing. And I discussed this in the book quite a bit. As a matter of fact, I have a whole chapter dedicated to discussing this idea that we bifurcated the idea of suffering from the idea of continuing to live. So we thought, well, animals have an interest in not suffering, but they don't have an interest in continuing to live. Because in order to have an interest in continuing to live, you've got to have a certain sort of self-awareness. You have to have a concept of your life. You have to, that sort of thing. And as a matter of fact, what's interesting is there were a number of people who wrote about this in the 19th century and who were influential, but the person who was probably most influential was Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a really interesting guy. And he had a lot, he had, his thinking about this was really quite interesting. Bentham was a utilitarian. And so he rejected moral rights. As a matter of fact, he's the one who made the statement that rights are nonsense on stilts. Moral rights are nonsense on stilts. He made that comment. He thought moral rights were ridiculous. However, he believed that chattel slavery as an institution was wrong. Now, why did he believe that? Nobody really knows, although I have written about this because I think there is an answer to that. And I think the answer is that Bentham believed in the principle of equal consideration. He believed that you had to give, everyone was to count for one. No one counts for more than one. No one counts for less than one. Bentham knew that slavery, he never said this, but I believe if you look at what he says about slavery, you'll see that my extrapolation from what he says to what I think he meant is not unreasonable. That is, Bentham saw the institution of slavery as systematically devaluing the interests of the humans who were slaves, so that in any conflict between a slave and a slave owner, the slave owner had to win because the slave's interests had to weigh less, or else you didn't have slavery. You see, and I think Bentham saw that there was an institutional problem with slavery, but he didn't see that. He thought that animals could continue to be property and we could just treat them better. And it didn't matter if we killed them, because Bentham said they don't have a concept of themselves. They don't care that we kill them. The cow doesn't care that we kill and eat her. She just cares about how we treat her and how we slaughter her. But she's not concerned about the end of her, about her life ending. She's not concerned about that. And so we had this bifurcation of the interest in continuing to live from the interest in suffering. That's the problem. The problem is that we have this fantasy that we can continue to kill animals and use them, but we can honor our moral obligations to them to treat them well. And the problem is that's a fantasy. That's a fantasy. That it's a fantasy because anybody who understands anything about economics, and I'm not talking about complicated economics, I'm talking about economics that you learn for your first semester of college. There are things called markets. Animals are property. They are things. It costs money to protect their interests. The more you spend on protecting their interests, the higher the cost of animal ownership goes up. And there are markets. So if you, and there are now international markets. This is the interesting thing too, is that, when Marx was writing, he didn't really, there were national markets. He didn't, Marx didn't think about whether or not there was going to be a NAFTA or a GATT or a European Union or anything like that. He didn't, European Economic Community. He didn't understand that stuff. He wasn't thinking about capital crossing national boundaries. Well, that's the reality of now. So if you have let's say all of a sudden, some country decides that it's going to increase its animal welfare dramatically. Well, what's going to happen is, unless you prohibit imports, if there's a demand for the lower welfare product, it's going to flood in unless you block it from coming in. You can't. It's all subject to market forces, and the market forces always keep the level of animal protection very, very low. And so I believe the problem is that that we've embraced this fantasy. It's very convenient for us. We've embraced this fantasy, just as, by the way, people like Thomas Jefferson, and I quote him in the book, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of our founding fathers, somebody we revere. As a matter of fact, I went to the University of Virginia, and I don't think that there was 5 inches where there wasn't a statue of Thomas Jefferson. He was all over the place. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. It was as if the guy never died. He was with us every minute. And Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. And he justified slavery by saying they're different from us. They don't have the same level of cognition that we have. They're more creatures of sensation, not reflection. I quote him in the book. I mean, he's one of our founding fathers. Wow. He believed in equality, except when he didn't. But that's the same, that's how we think about animals. We think about them as, do I think my dogs have an interest in continuing to live? Of course they do. They're sentient. They're sentient beings. Every sentient being has an interest in continuing to live, because sentience is only a means to the end of continued existence. This is something that has been missed, and I do not understand why. It's a simple idea. If you are a sentient being, you are the sort of being who has evolved a mechanism which helps you to continue to live. To say that you're sentient, but you don't have an interest in continuing to live is like saying that you have eyes, but you don't have an interest in continuing to see. It's crazy. It just makes no sense. And so we've embraced this idea that animals don't have an interest in continuing to live, and that their lives are sort of meaningless. Let me see if I can find it quickly. This is I quote this in the book too. I have a whole chapter in which I explain why Singer, and what I do is in the book, I talk about this concept of similar minds. And I say that we believe that animals matter and have an interest in living only to the extent that they have minds that are similar to us, which is ridiculous. Because first of all, we're never going to conclude that they have minds which are similar to us, because they're always going to be different. And those differences will always justify differential treatment as long as we have an interest in differential treatment, which we clearly do. And so I talk about Reagan and Singer, even though they're both different. Reagan's a rights theorist, Peter is a utilitarian. But even though they're very, very different, they both link moral status to some. I mean, Peter talks about sentience, but he thinks you need to have self-awareness to have an interest in continuing to live. Tom talks about subjects of a life, and subject of a life is by definition a being who is self-aware. My view is that's all nonsense. All you need is sentience. I don't really care whether they can recognize themselves in mirrors. Peter thinks that this is a big thing. Can you recognize yourself in a mirror? My answer is, who cares whether they can? I mean, they don't need to brush their hair. So who cares whether they recognize themselves in mirrors? I don't really care. It's ridiculous. Are they self-aware? Right before I started this with y'all, I took my dogs for a walk. It's already like, it's already India-like in its humidity here. I mean, talk about global warming, but right now we are having a heat wave and a humidity wave that is unbelievable. And I just took the dogs out for a walk, and I was noticing how they go to the same, I take them around, I live on a circle. And so I walk them around the circle, and they always tend to pee in the same place. Now, they recognize where they've been before because they have a sense of scent, which is different from mine. So yeah, they can't look at themselves in the mirror and recognize themselves, but they can recognize that they know who they have a sense of themselves, and they have a sense of the other. They play with each other. You can't play, a dog can't play with another dog without a sense of self, without some sense of self and other. It's impossible. And so we've got this idea that animals have to be like us. They have to have some sort of mental apparatus, which is like ours. And the answer is why? Well, who says? Why? Why is that relevant? And the answer is Tom doesn't answer that. Peter doesn't answer that. Jeff McMahon doesn't answer that. Nobody answers. As a matter of fact, I've just sent Jeff McMahon at Oxford the book, and he told me he's going to get back to me as soon as he reads it. But I want to know what Jeff thinks about this, because I have a high regard for Jeff, and I'm sort of curious as to why he thinks that he makes the statement that animal lives matter a whole lot less than ours because we're so complicated. And the answer is, who cares whether that's what that's what an intellectual says, that intellectual ideas are important. So I'm more important because I'm an intellectual. And the answer is, okay. So does that mean that if you're a worker and, you don't really care about the opera, or you don't care about Shakespeare, or you don't care about, those things are not important, does that mean your life matters less because you don't go to the opera? And I think that's the implication of all of this. I think that, the problem is that we've linked the moral status of animals with having the sorts of minds that philosophy professors have. And the answer is, if that's the case, then we're, everybody who's not a philosophy professor or isn't an intellectual is somehow, lesser. And, that's the position you want to take. Great. I disagree with that. And I just want to read you, I think it's on page, I'm just trying to find the section in Peter and you know what? I won't be able to find it now. There's a section, there's a point at which Peter says that, whether the cow lives 1 year or 10 years doesn't really matter, because, here it is, page 104. This is from the 3rd edition of, there's Peter smiling on the front. The premature death of the cow is not a tragedy in this sense, because whether cows live 1 year or 10, there is nothing that they hope to achieve. Come on. I mean, do you really believe that? And my view is the only way you can believe that is if you're sitting there thinking, I want to eat that cow, and I got to come up with something that justifies my eating that cow. And so I'll come up with something to say the cow doesn't care. I mean, you're right. The cow doesn't care about what the cow's going to do on her next sabbatical, because she doesn't get sabbaticals. Okay, so she doesn't care about that, and she doesn't care about going to the opera, and she doesn't care about, going to see a Fassbinder film or something. Who cares? She has her own set of interests. They may be boring interests to me, whether, she says, well, I'd rather go eat grass in that field rather than in this field. Who am I to say that interest matters less than my interest in going to the opera? And, frankly, to be honest with you, I don't particularly like opera, but so I'm just using that as an example, because, it's always, people are always saying, well, I remember once many years ago, debating a vivisector. And we were at Temple University in Philadelphia, but this woman was from the State University of New York, and she did animal research. And I remember her saying, the reason why it's all right for us to use rats and animals in research is they don't write symphonies, they don't do calculus, and she gave this list, and her name was Jerry. I remember Jerry. And I said, Jerry, I said, I haven't written any symphonies. Have you? When was the last symphony you wrote? And she said, well, I've never written a symphony. And I said, so then why are we talking about? I said, so is it okay to use you in a biomedical experiment because you've never written a symphony? And she said, well, no, because I'm a member of a species that can write symphonies. I said, who cares? Why is that morally relevant? I think this is the problem. And I love Cora Diamond, but I disagree with her. I do. I mean, I'm very close to Cora, have been all my life, or most of my adult life. And she's a dear person, but she's wrong on this. There's a very simple answer. And that is, animals are property. And we have divorced their interest in life for their interest in not suffering. We only talk about their interest in not suffering, but because they're property, the level of protection is always going to be low. So the bottom line is if you say, okay, fine, the solution is they shouldn't be property anymore. I agree. That's my solution. The problem is, once you say they shouldn't be property anymore, then you can't continue to exploit them, because all of the institutional exploitation of them is based on the fact that they're property. You see? And so it's really quite simple. It really, there's no rocket science here. And the thing is that we as intellectuals spend our time sort of looking at these little close issues to try to sort of, but right now I'm working on something which may or may not come to anything. I'm not sure. It'll depend. But on the political turn, this business where, Will Kymlicka and Susan Donaldson, they talk about, well, Francione's too negative. He thinks he should abolish abolish animal use, and that way we wouldn't have relationships. Well, we should bring them into we should make them citizens. We should bring them into our. I have no idea what that means. I'm not sure that Will does either. I have no idea what that means. it's several years ago, we had a conference at Rutgers. It was a one-day conference, and I invited Will and Sue, and we all sat around. You can actually find it on the internet somewhere. The whole thing is on the internet. We had this conference where we sat around and talked about this stuff, and I made the statement then. I continue now to still be completely bewildered. What does it mean to bring them into our political system? What does that mean? You know, they are domesticated animals. They are animals we bring into existence because they are submissive, because they are subservient, and because we can manage them. And so we bring them into existence. What does it mean to say we're going to make them citizens? What does that mean? And the answer is, I'd like to know because I don't understand. So my view is you got to get rid of it. You just have to abolish it. It means we stop eating them, wearing them, using them. And then eventually the demand for domesticated animals goes down. We shouldn't have any domesticated animals, including our dogs and cats and whatever else. We shouldn't have, domestication is itself problematic. But anyway, so that's what I think. I think it's a simple answer.
And that's an answer which raises a lot of questions. But just to take off from what you said about Kimlicka and Donaldson, you know, the book that they've written together, it also focuses a lot on rights and legal rights. Whereas in your book, you specifically mentioned that you're not talking about legal rights, but that you're talking about moral rights. Um, and but you do say that you do want these moral rights to translate to legal rights at some point. So why is that distinction important?
Because I mean, Bentham believed in legal rights. Utilitarians can believe in legal rights. I mean, all a legal right is you've got some interest which is protected by a law. So, so you could say in one sense that animals have a right to be humanely slaughtered because there are laws in the United States and other places that require that animals be slaughtered humanely. So you could say, well, they have a right to be slaughtered humanely, which I think is a strange way to use the word right. You know, and so, you know, when so Bentham talks about rights, Will talks about rights. I mean, what I understand from what Will and Sue are saying is that they don't think we should be killing animals to eat them, but they think it's okay for us to use them for dairy or for eggs or things like that. And, you know, I mean, I deal with that in the book and basically say there's no morally coherent distinction between eating meat and dairy and eggs and all the rest of it. And as you know, I think you know, because I think you were in that thing I did in London. I think that's where I met you. I'm a Jain, and you know, I mean, I spend my life talking to other Jains who are vegetarians, but who continue to eat. They don't eat eggs, although they do eat them in cakes and stuff like that. But they don't eat eggs as a food. But they drink lots of milk, and indeed, you take your life in your hands if you get between a Jain and the dairy dessert or their paneer or their chai tea. You take your life in your hands because you might get killed, but non-violently. And so, you know, but I spend my time talking with other Jains about the fact that there's no morally coherent distinction between meat and other animal products. So yeah, Will and Sue might talk about legal rights, but legal rights are sort of irrelevant in the sense that when you talk about the moral right not to be property, what it means is I mean, Susan, you could say that in the 18th century, there were laws that said about certain things you couldn't do with slaves. Does that mean that slaves had rights? And I argue that no, that doesn't mean they have rights only in an idiosyncratic sense, but not in a meaningful way. They don't have respect-based rights. They don't have respect-based rights. They have rights which, you know, they have interests which are supposedly protected by laws, although they're not very well protected. But they have interests which are protected by laws, but they don't have respect-based rights because you can't have respect for a slave. You can't have a right, but you can't have a respect-based right for animal. To say that an animal has a right to be slaughtered humanely is, in my judgment, absurd. So, you know, but that's you know, I mean,
But
look, I mean, I understand that Will and I look, I mean, I'm not sure what to make of this political turn stuff, except that it seems to me it's yet another effort by academics to continue to justify some level of animal use. And so now we're thinking, well, we're going to make them members of the political community. You know, and I'm sitting here thinking, gee whiz, you know, it's interesting that they're talking about giving labor rights to animals. I live in a country where most humans don't have decent labor rights, and I don't know what we're talking about. We're talking about we're going to give border collies rights or something like that. I mean, I don't know. And so I don't even know what this means, and I'm not sure they know what it means. I think it's just, I think it's very much an academic exercise, and I think it's a way of perpetuating the idea that there are benign ways to continue to exploit animals, but I don't see it as much more than that.
Um, just to go back to one of your earlier answers, I thought that one of the most interesting things that you did in the book was to take up suffering and show that we can recognize that animals are suffering, but still think that they don't have a morally significant interest in their lives. And,
Right.
I immediately made the connections to Bentham and to Derrida's take on that. And Derrida's take on this particular thing about animals and how we respond to animal suffering, that's been the basis of a lot of contemporary work, which focuses on animal vulnerability and how we can share that vulnerability, and how humans share that kind of finitude of mortality or something like that that we do with the animals. And perhaps that could be that is the basis of our kinship with them, why we have so much in common, and could be the basis of granting them moral status. And I was wondering what you think about this talk about animal vulnerability and human vulnerability, though even intuitively, I think that human vulnerability is just so different from animal vulnerability. But I was wondering if you think that is a kind of limitation to think in this particular way.
Well, it's still, you still have to address. You could say that, you could take this vulnerability position and say that this means um, that we ought to pay more attention to suffering issues, that we ought to reduce suffering, which I don't believe we can do as long as animals are still property. But you still need to address at some point or another whether animals have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. So you still need to address the philosophical question of, is it okay to kill the animal if the animal is completely not aware of being killed? In other words, you still have to answer the question, is it okay for me to walk up to the cow and shoot the cow in the head, killing the cow immediately? And the answer to that is, well, is it okay if I sneak into your room tonight while you're sleeping and shoot you? You don't feel anything. If I do it right, you won't feel anything. You just die. And the answer to that for most of us is going to be no, because I have taken away, I've done something wrong. I took something away from you, your interest in continuing to live. We tend to think that there's no problem if you go up and you kill the cow completely humanely or without suffering, because you haven't taken anything away from the cow, because she doesn't really have an interest in continuing to live. So you can talk about vulnerability. Vulnerability might get you someplace in terms of talking about suffering. I do think you need to address the bottom line of, do you think that animals have a morally valuable, or more, do they have a morally significant interest in continuing to live? Till you answer that question, you're not going to know exactly what your normative obligations are. That's a problem. And so, and that's what I think. I mean, so I think that the bottom line is, many people would say that if I raise the cow completely, I raise the cow as a member of my family. And then one day I just go out and I'm petting the cow and boom, shoot the cow. Cow drops, cow dies completely painlessly. I haven't done anything wrong. I think I've done something wrong. In the same way that if I treated you really well and I was nice to you and blah, 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 and then one day while you were sleeping, I just blew your brains out, I would be doing something wrong. It would be better that I do that than that I torture you as well. So, but that doesn't answer the question. The question is, have I done something wrong by killing you? And that's the problem. The problem is, whether it's the vulnerability approach, whether it's Singer's approach, Reagan's approach, anybody's approach, if you separate suffering from the interest in continuing to live, I believe you're going to end up with the wrong answer. You're going to end up with some version of, it's okay for us to continue this. We just need to do it differently. That's the problem.
I have
And
a question related to that, and I'm thinking about like Radhika Rajan recently had a book out called Intimacies, where she talked about
who is this?
um, Radhika Govindarajan.
Oh,
She had a book called Animal Intimacies,
yeah.
which is about human animal relationships in Central Himalayas, where she talks about how animal sacrifice is practiced in these communities, but still there's a very strong emotional bond between the person and the animal. And I'm also thinking about um, Gary Snyder, who's been influenced by Buddhism, but also Native American traditions, where he talks about relationships between people and animals, where in some specific circumstances, I know it sounds really bizarre, but where the animal kind of offers himself or herself up to the person as a kind of gift. And I'm thinking, if we take these two instances, but also keep in mind that it is not possible for all relationships between people and animals to be the same, then could we account for difference in the way we see animals and not arrive at the same conclusion that you do about the moral significance of their lives in wanting to live?
Well, but that's like saying if I'm in a culture which practices female genital mutilation and 8-year-old girls willingly give themselves to be altered, is that okay? And the answer is no, not in my view, maybe in yours, not in mine. I don't buy this. The animal, this is a metaphor. This is a metaphor. I mean, look, let me just cut to it so that you understand where I'm coming from. I reject all of this stuff that just because it's part of somebody's culture or because some indigenous people did it, it's okay. I don't believe that for a second. I think that that's very, I mean, what I find really sad is that that sort of thinking gets associated with left wing, the whole idea about the intersectionalism, which I don't think is left wing at all. I think it's pretty reactionary. It's this idea that tradition can, I mean, everything we've ever identified as morally problematic is part of somebody's tradition. Take sexism and patriarchy, for example. It's certainly traditional. It's certainly part of indigenous cultures. Who cares? The question is not what part of a cult, whether it's part of a culture. The issue is it right or wrong? And now you could say, well, I can't answer that question because as far as I'm concerned, if it's part of an indigenous culture, it's right. Well, I don't understand what that means. You need to make an argument to explain to me because I when I was teaching animal ethics last year at Rutgers, I had a student who said to me, well, but wait a minute, use the Native American thing and said, but wait a minute, aren't you being, a cultural hegemonist by saying that, that it was wrong for the Native Americans to do this? I said, let me ask you a question. I said, there are cultures which practice female genital mutilation. Is that okay? Because some cultures practice it and because some of them are very old and they've been doing it for a very long time. And she said, no. And I said, so what's the difference? And she said, well, one of them is harmful. I said, well, the other one's harmful too. I said, it's just you're valuing the animals differently from the way that you value the women. And I said, my view is that commodifying either of them is not morally acceptable. And so if you wish to introduce some anthropocentric idea, some speciesist idea, that's fine, but understand that's what you're doing. And so I don't, this business about, yes, I agree that what the Native Americans did, I mean, they weren't engaging in factory farming. Yes, true, they weren't. So what they did, is not the same as factory farming, but it's still wrong in my judgment. It is still wrong, and it doesn't become right because it's part of the tradition, and it doesn't become right because we can't make it right by saying, well, the animal offers them. I've seen animals killed in a whole bunch of different situations. I've never seen a situation in which I would say, gee, there's an instance where the animal is going along with that and is perfectly happy with that situation. And I can't, I just don't believe that. And in the same way that if you said to me, Well, here's a culture which practices human sacrifice. And these people are totally inculcated with these ideas. So therefore, the person who's chosen feels honored. Is it okay to kill that person? And the answer is not in my judgment. It's different from murdering somebody on the streets of New York City. It's clearly different, but it doesn't mean it's okay. And I do think, I mean, this is, you know, this is one of the things that you see a lot in the literature. Part of what I'm working on now is sort of addressing all of this political turn stuff and you know, what is viewed as intersectionalism in animal rights, which is actually, as you probably know, intersectionalism, when Kim Crenshaw first used it, was talking about the fact that, for example, Black women were discriminated against both as women and as Blacks because there was an intersectional relationship between the discriminate. There are different sorts of discrimination. There's discrimination against Blacks, there's discrimination against women. If you're a Black woman, boom. If you're a Black woman and you're a lesbian, boom, boom. You know, you get hit all from these. That's what Crenshaw was talking about with intersectionalism. Now, intersectionalism amongst animal people means that if something is part of a tradition or is part of an indigenous culture, then it's okay. And I don't know why. I have no idea why that's called intersectional. And as far as I'm concerned, it's just pure speciesism. But it's speciesism that comes from people supposedly on the left who are saying that, well, you know, we're opposed to colonialism. Well, fine, be opposed to colonialism, but that doesn't mean that pre-colonial societies were just wonderful places that didn't practice any rights violations. They did. So the fact that, you know, there's the fact that I'm not, obviously the British should not have gone in to colonize India, but that doesn't mean that India was the Garden of Eden before the British came in and it was like free of rights violations. And it was only the British who introduced the rights violations. That's not true. They introduced different rights violations, but there were rights violations going on before. So I think we have to be careful about fetishizing indigenous societies or traditions or whatever. You know, I think we have to be really careful about that. There was somebody on my Facebook page who said, this happened yesterday, said, well, what about people who live in places where they absolutely have to kill animals? And the answer is, well, how would you feel if the only way that a group of people could live was to practice cannibalism? Would that be okay? Now, I've tried that before, and most people say, no, that wouldn't be okay. I said, so what if the only way they could live is cannibalism? The answer is, well, they'd have to move. And I'd say, well, fine. Then if you're telling me that, I mean, part of the problem with this hypothetical is that in most places where people have no access to anything other than meat, it's generally often, not always, often the case that those are cultures where there are grains grown, but they're basically grains that are grown to feed to animals that are going to be then, or grains that are going to be exported so that Western people can continue to eat meat 37,000 times a day. And you know, and so it's a problem of food distribution more than it is a problem of food availability. But if you have a situation in which it's absolutely impossible to live without exploiting animals, then I think, you know, that doesn't make it right. It may at most make it excusable. It doesn't make it justifiable. But if humans, you always have to ask the question, what would it be like if humans were involved? And if it's not acceptable where humans are involved, then it's not clear to me why it would be acceptable where non-humans are involved. Because we don't require that for humans to matter. That's another point I make in the book, is we don't require for humans to matter that they have particular intellectual skills. As a matter of fact, if you've got somebody who's basically mentally disabled, let's assume you've got somebody who's, well, let's take a real live example. There are people who have extreme dementia. I mean, extreme dementia. And they're stuck in an eternal present. They have no recollections of the past, no projections into the future. They're just stuck in an eternal present. They are as stuck in an eternal present as any dog is. As a matter of fact, dogs are probably far more future-oriented and have past recollection far more than some humans who have advanced dementia. We don't think that it's okay to use people who have advanced dementia as non-consenting subjects in biomedical experiments or to use them as forced organ donors. Why? Because we recognize sentience is all that is needed for human personhood. The problem is we need to, what I'm arguing is we need to recognize that that the only thing necessary for animal personhood is sentience and nothing more is needed.
Yeah, I was really interested to know why you used personhood and sentience are two very important concepts in this book. But I got the sense that while sentience makes a lot of sense, uh, would it be would foregrounding personhood and saying that animals moral patients and are therefore persons as well be anthropocentric, because why do we have to resort to a definition of personhood or talk about animals in those terms to grant them moral status?
Because personhood is not, it's not anthropocentric, because all personhood means, that what I try to argue in the book is that all personhood means is a person is somebody who has a morally significant interest in continuing to live. We generally we limit that to humans, but I'm saying we shouldn't limit it to humans. And persons just identifies those who have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. That's all.
Mm.
And you know, I mean, I understand your question. I mean, why talk about personhood at all? Because that is a that is a way we think, we understand. We say moral agents are persons. That's the easy case. But we also say moral patients are persons, by which we mean is they have a morally significant interest in continuing to live, and we can't use them as exclusively as means to our ends. And I'm just trying to say that, all right, in that category, we need to include all sentient beings. And so that's sort of decoupling. As I say in the book, we have come to think of person and human as synonymous. That's a problem. We need to see that really what we're talking about with personhood is that which those beings who have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. And we see this when we talk about abortion, for example. When people are talking about, well, is a fetus a person? Well, the question is not, is the fetus human? The fetus is clearly human. If you allow the fetus to gestate, the fetus is not, if a woman gets pregnant and she doesn't terminate the pregnancy, then she doesn't give birth to a squirrel. She gives birth to, or a giraffe. She gives birth to a baby, a human baby, because we're not talking about whether the fetus is a human. The fetus is clearly human. Is the fetus a person? We're asking a different question. We're saying, does a fetus have a morally significant interest in continuing to live? And so I'm just using personhood to describe the class of beings who have a morally significant interest in continuing to live. And I'm trying to decouple it from human.
Right. But if we were to decouple human and person, then on the one hand, it seems to me that humans could be called a kind of animal, and we just need to recognize other animals as animals that are sentient. But on the other hand, I'm also thinking that in your book there's a lot of emphasis on the rational argument you're making and the reason behind those arguments. And I feel like that rationality and reason, that's also specific to the human animal. And I think maybe that's why the idea of personhood is troubling, because if it is the rational, moral human being that you're appealing to while you're making these arguments, then wouldn't wanting to attribute personhood to the animal be the same kind of move that Singer or Regan's making?
No, because what Singer and Reagan are doing is they're trying to say that the animals that matter are the ones who have intellectual capabilities like ours. I need to be able to use rationality. How else am I going to convince you? I can convince you. I can change your behavior one of two ways. I can either use physical force, or I can persuade you. Um, I'm a Jane. I don't use physical force. But the only way I can convince you to stop eating animals or to stop wearing animals is to discuss the issue with you. And so rational discussion is necessary in order to change behavior. If you're not going to use physical force, if I ran the world and I was able to just impose my will by force, I suppose I wouldn't have to worry about rational argument. Then I'd have other moral issues I have to worry about. But I don't, unfortunately, run the world, and so therefore all I can do is try to persuade to try to address people's rationality, to try to address things rationally. But rationality, I mean, the thing of it is that rationality is rationality doesn't tell us, rationality can't tell us what we should want. Rationality, this is why I always say you can't use rationality to try to get people to care about moral issues. You really can't. What you can do is to say, if you do care about moral issues, then we can talk about how to realize those values. But if you don't care, I mean, I say this in the book, if you don't care about animals, if you say, look, I just don't give a damn about animals, there's nothing I can do to persuade you to be interested, to care about animals. In the same way that if I say, look, Susan, you shouldn't be racist. You always say these things about Black people, and you really shouldn't say these things about Black people. And if you say, look, I don't care about Black people, I think they're inferior. There's nothing I can say to you. I mean, I can say to you, well, Susan, why do you think that they're inferior? And we can talk. But if you come to the end of it and you say, look, I don't care what the hell you say. I don't care what similarities there are. I think they're different. I don't care about them. There's really nothing I can say to you then. What I can say to you is, if you say, I care about the equality of all people, I could say, well, Susan, then we need to worry about the fact that we have income distribution, which prevents that equal treatment, or whatever. I mean, we can talk about that rationally. Well, we can't. We need rationality to be able to talk about. I mean, we are animals. We are animals that our ethics don't. Our normative behaviors are not. At least as far as I'm aware, ingrained in. We need to think about what our normative behaviors are, because if the history of humankind is quite clear that for many of us, violence is something that we think is perfectly fine. I mean, it's why I'm attracted to Jainism so much, is because I just love the idea of nonviolence. I just love the idea of nonviolence. I think it is the ultimate truth of the universe. It really is. It's the ultimate truth of the universe.
And
Can I ask you something?
would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'd like to go ahead, Susan. Yeah. So, Gary, thank you. The big takeaway here, I think, also for the rest of us, is the assertion that you made in your book, and that we've also sort of deduced from the talk we've had today with you. Differences do not have to mean a lack of equality. You can be different from the other, but it does not mean that you don't have to be equal, at least as far as moral status is concerned. And I get that we're not talking about legal rights here, because the category in itself is kind of problematic. Secondly, my question here for you would be, because you've talked about veganism as one strategy, a way of life of practicing a morally just way of living with animals, by not consuming them, by not treating them as property, by looking at them as, well, by according them personhood, which I understand as the opposite of treating them as property, right?
Right.
Now, where do you stand about the way people treat animals that they do not use as property, but do not tolerate around them either? Think about, I don't know, cockroaches, mosquitoes, all kinds of bugs, mice, rats, birds that are largely unwanted nowadays in urban environments, in buildings and whatever. We do not kill them. We do not kill them to eat them, or want their eggs or their milk or whatever. We just don't want them around. So we might be practicing vegans in our lives, in our personal lives, in the fact that we do not wear leather, we do not eat meat, milk, or eggs and other things. But at the same time, we do not want the animal in our lives, anywhere around it, anywhere in our sight. Is
Well,
that
that's a
something
great,
that could be
yeah,
covered
yeah.
by the vegan approach?
That's a great question. I would say this. What I'm interested in doing is to abolishing institutionalized exploitation. If we all woke up tomorrow and we were all vegans, because we all recognized that we can't justify our continued use of animals, we would change how we address these issues. Because right now we think about them only in terms of beings who institutionally participate in killing roughly 80 billion animals a year. I mean, if you think about it, we kill for food alone
Yeah.
more animals in 1 year than the number of human beings who have ever lived on the planet. I mean, it's an astounding number. And so that's who's thinking about the cockroaches and the mice. Once you accept veganism for ethical reasons, your whole way of thinking about these things changes. So for example, this morning when I was walking the dogs, when I walk, I don't walk on grass because I don't want to kill insects. I don't know whether they're sentient. I really don't know whether they're sentient. They may be, they may not be. I don't know. I err in favor of not killing them. So I don't walk on grass. When I was walking, I saw at least 3 or 4 worms on the street, on the road that I walk on. And I picked them up and I put them in the grass. We live in the country. We live in woods, basically. And we have a lot of mice around. Now, we don't use traps to lethal traps. If we get a mouse in the house, we have we have these traps in which they go in and then the door closes, but there's nothing that hurts them. And then we pick them up and we put them outside and then they come back in the house again, whatever. But, but we don't kill anything. If I find an insect in the house, as I said, we live in the country. I found snakes in the house, and you just have to get over your fear. I put gloves on, and they're not poisonous snakes, but I put gloves on and I pick up the snake, I put it outside. I don't kill anything. And so and I think that if we lived in, we're not going to get to those questions until we're vegans. And once we're vegans, we're going to answer those questions differently. Once we recognize the immorality of the institutionalized exploitation of animals, then we'll go on to address the different question. And I admit it's a different question, but how do we deal with the conflicts between ourselves and wild animals, or animals that are semi-wild that live in urban environments and things like that? And my view is that you've got to come up with solutions which don't involve killing them. And so, the starting point is killing them is always the wrong solution. So, you got to figure out solutions which are, look, I'm from New York. When I first moved to where I live now, I saw spiders that I've never seen before. I mean, there are spiders that, that are quite large. They have hair on them. They're large, but it scared the hell out of me. And I had to sort of overcome that and learn how to put a little jar on top of them and move it and take them outside. I don't kill them. And so my view is that, you resolve the conflicts, however you resolve them. Killing is the wrong way to start your thinking about it. And so, but we're not going to get to that point. In the same way, for example, I don't think we should have pets. I mean, I'm sure you do too. I love my dogs. I love them. If there were only 2 dogs left on the planet and it were up to me whether they continue to breed so that we could have dogs, the answer would be not on your life. I think domestication is wrong. I don't think we should own pets. And we do own them, whether I want to accept that, whether you want to accept, they're property. And people say, well, no, they're not my property. They're my family members. Nonsense. They're my family members, but I could decide right now that I want to take my family members to a shelter that kills them and dump them. I could kill them myself right now because they're my property. The fact that I value them as family members is simply an incident of their being property. I can value them high, I can value them low. And so I don't think we should, but we're not going to ever get to the question of domestication while we're all eating animals. While we're all eating animals, you can't really have a very interesting discussion. Indeed, it comes across as an insane discussion about whether or not we should have domestication. And I remember once I was debating a vivisector on the radio. His name was Adrian Morrison. I remember this very well. And he's he was then a very well-known vivisector. This is probably 25 years ago. And Adrian said, why don't you be honest and tell people that the implication of what you're saying is that we shouldn't have pets? I said, I'm not hiding that, Adrian. I don't think we should have pets. He said, but you've got dogs. And I said, that's right. And I said, that's because there's zillions of them. And what are we going to do? We can't kill them. We can't let them go. They're domesticated animals. We brought them into existence because they are dependent on us. So we ought to care for them. And then we ought to care for the ones who are here now, but we ought not to bring any more in existence. And by the way, before any of you ask, all my dogs are vegans. And they have been for decades. And no animal products in this house, nothing. And so, you know, I mean, so we shouldn't, you know, but we're not going to ever get we're never going to get to the issue of pets as long as we're eating them. We can only get to that point. We can only get there. The only reason why I talk about domestication is because if I don't acknowledge that that's the implication of what I'm saying, then people say, well, you know, you're not being consistent because you believe it's all right to have pets, but you don't think it's all right for us to eat animals. And the answer is no, I don't think it's okay for us to have pets at all. You know, but in any event, some other people had questions. I can't pay attention to the chat. I'm not like you younger people who can sort of multitask and read things and stuff like that. I have to, let me see, let me go to the chat and I'll see if I can get, all right. Okay. Is it, if I'm pronouncing it wrongly, tell me. Anjali. I think I just answered that.
Yeah. Hi, Gary. This is
Hi.
Anjali.
Hi,
You
Anjali.
did answer my question, but I have a lot of questions creeping up in my head. So I would right away go to the next one. By the way, thank you very much. It was really nice, and a big shout out to the organizers also for bringing
Yeah.
you to us.
Okay.
So the
I'm
question
willing.
was,
I'm willing to spend more time answering questions. I'll stay on longer. I don't care. I mean, it's, you
okay,
know.
is it okay if I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Susan?
Of course. Of
Certainly,
course. Of
Anjali,
course.
go
Yeah,
ahead.
because my question is already answered about keeping a pet. So the thing is, I roam around quite a lot in forests and all that, being a bird watcher. So I keep thinking about these things when I come to cities. There are people who talk about veganism and animal rights and everything. And the same people, like when it comes to when we go to forests, we meet tribals there, and these are really poor people, who many of them, like some tribes that I know, they still indulge in hunting as a primary source of food. And then I have seen them actually catching field rats, and that not big animals, killing of big animals, because that's legally also not possible in India. So they are not poachers, but their everyday diet, they do take from these wild areas. So they take rats or rat family animals and small birds they kill. So I was just wondering, where do we as urban people, urban humans, when we talk about veganism and all that is fine, when we talk about industrialized killing of animals and domestication from that perspective, but somebody who is living in a forest edge and has no other source of food as such, protein, if we talk about, and they've been killing small animals. So where do we draw the line then the survival and then being vegan? Is there
Well,
some line that we can draw? And because with them we can't talk about veganism. So yeah, that's my question.
situations where there are compulsions, um, the use might be the use might be excusable. It's not right. It's not morally right. I mean, for example, let me give you a hypothetical. Let's assume I'm on a desert island, and I'm shipwrecked on a desert island with you, and we're the only people on. You and I are the only people. We've both been shipwrecked together. We were on the same little boat, and we got shipwrecked. And I'm starving to death, and you're starving to death, and there's nothing around for us to eat. There's no plant products, no plant foods around for us to eat. Is it all right for me to kill and eat you? And the answer is no, it's not all right for me to kill and eat you. Although if I do kill and eat you, we understand why I did it, and it's
Yeah,
different from, and and there are cases, there are law cases where people have killed other people and eaten
yeah,
them in extreme
yeah,
situations. And we say, well, that's not right, but we understand why they did it, and their sentences, their jail sentences mitigated, or their matter of fact, I teach criminal law, one of the courses I teach, and the first case in my case book is these guys are on a boat and they're starving and they're shipwrecked, and there's four of them, and 3 of them kill this one guy and they eat him. And then after like 20 days without food, and then they are rescued and they're sentenced to death. And Queen Victoria commutes their sentence and to 6 months imprisonment and lets them out. Why? Not because Queen Victoria thought that eating people was okay, but because we recognize it doesn't make sense to punish people in that situation because they didn't really have a choice. So to the extent that situations are analogizable to that, it's not that it was justifiable, it was excusable. And so I see the situation as being similar. Doesn't mean that what those people are doing is right. It means that it may be excusable because they don't have a choice. However, this is why the abolitionist approach is not just about humans. It's about it's basically a theory of nonviolence and a theory of non-discrimination. And in order to have non-discrimination, in order to have nonviolence, you need to have more equitable distribution of resources. The problem is poverty, and poverty sucks. It's a terrible thing. And there is no reason for poverty. That's the sad thing is that we wouldn't have to live in a communistic world. If we all gave up a small amount, and I'm thinking particularly about Americans and people in Western countries as a general, if we all gave up a small amount, nobody would starve. That's the thing. That's the sad thing, is that we wouldn't have to be living in caves. I mean, we're talking about a more equitable distribution of resources would mean no one would have to starve. And I believe that a commitment to nonviolence, this is again where I have a problem with my Jain friends, is because most Jains are not willing to say that we ought to have a democratic socialism sort of thing. They're not willing to talk about socialism. I believe we are obligated to talk about socialism. We need democratic socialism. That's, and so, I mean, I can go into urban areas in this country, and you say, well, these people have really no choice. They've got to eat, they've got to eat McDonald's or they're going to starve to death because there are no. And the thing is, this is the problem. The problem is in urban areas, people can get fast food, which is going to kill them. They can get liquor, they can get drugs, but there are no supermarkets for them to get fresh vegetables. That's a problem. And that's something that we need to work on, because that's a form of racism. That's a form of discrimination. It's actually more classism. We don't talk about classism anymore. We talk about racism, but classism is the bigger problem. Racism is a sub problem under class. But so I think that, it doesn't mean what those people in the forest are doing is right. The thing is, why the hell are those people there in the first place? Why are they not able to, eating rats is not a good idea from a health point of view, putting aside from it doesn't help the rats and it doesn't help the humans either. So, I mean, why are we living in a world? I mean, I have to tell you something. I've wanted to come to India so badly. I've had probably 20 invitations that they, I mean, I don't like to travel because traveling is harmful to the environment. And so basically now, most of the talks I give on by online because I don't believe in traveling. Air travel is very, very, very damaging to the environment, kills a lot of animal stuff. And so I don't like to do it. But I would love to visit India because I feel a very great spiritual sort of attraction of India. And I haven't gone because I'm terrified of seeing the poverty that I know I'm going to see. We're just better at hiding it. We've got horrible poverty here, but we're really excellent about hiding it. We confine it to areas you don't see it. Horrible poverty, but you don't see it. I know in India, it's just more out in the open. And so I'm going to see poverty, and I'm going to see animals that are in bad situations. I'm going to see dogs that have mange. I'm going to see all sorts of things. And it just, I don't have that courage. I'm not, I've been in slaughterhouses before and I've been in all sorts of situations, but I don't have the courage to sort of confront that while I'm supposedly enjoying myself visiting, Jain temples or something like that. It just doesn't, it's upsetting to me. But I think the problem is, it's like you look at India, you have tremendous wealth, and then you've got this poverty. Same thing here. You've got splendid wealth, and then you've got this horrible poverty. That's wrong. The problem is not how do we, can we come up with a theory which justifies poor people exploiting animals? Thing is, why do we have that poverty in the first place? That's the prior question that needs to be answered. And there is no good answer to that. And you can't sort of say, well, because people who have more money have just worked harder? And the answer is that doesn't answer the question, because they've got opportunities. You know, I was not born into a family with money. As a matter of fact, my parents didn't go to college, and we, you know, we had very, very little money. But I was a white man, and I was able to go to university and to become a lawyer and to become, you know, to go to law school, to go to graduate school in philosophy, to come out, and I worked in a big firm, a big law firm, and then I went into a university. And so, yes, things are great. I have no complaints. But I have had opportunities that other people don't have. That's what we need to do, is we need to have equal opportunity. And we need to, you know, and the only way you really have equal opportunity, you don't have equal opportunity simply by affirmative action. You have to have equal opportunity by making resource distribution more equal. Because until kids are eating good food when they're kids, when they're young, when they're children, their brains don't develop. I mean, these kids in urban areas, they get horrible nutrition. They're eating garbage. They're first of all, they're not eating at all lots of times. And then lots of times they're eating junk that they, you know, they're eating, young kid. I mean, the average person who lives in an urban area is eating fast food like 6 times, 7 times a week, 8 times. I mean, that stuff will kill you, you know? And so this is the problem. Nonviolence is not just about, I mean, I always say, in order to live a nonviolent life, you have to be vegan, but being vegan isn't enough. In order to live a nonviolent life, you've got to be committed to other goals, and those goals have to include more equal treatment and more equal resource distribution. You know, and the problem is, in my country, they tax us, but they tax us so that they can finance the military industrial complex and more war machines. I wouldn't object if they taxed me because they wanted to redistribute wealth, and they wanted, you know, right now we're having a big fight in this country because Joe Biden, who's not exactly a radical, but compared to Donald Trump, he is a radical because Donald Trump was a fascist. And Joe Biden is proposing that a child tax credit, that you get a tax credit for kids. This will help lift children out of poverty. The problem with it is it doesn't go far enough. It'll be more money put into lifting kids out of poverty, because that's the rational thing to do. If you lift kids out of poverty, then you don't have generation after generation after generation of kids who don't get an education, who fail, who become drug addicts, who get sick. You know, that's what we need to do. And that's what nonviolence demands, in my judgment. So I always say, you know, I always tell people, you know, when animal people always say, well, you're too political. I always say, no, sorry. You cannot divorce, in my judgment, you can't talk about animal rights as some sort of isolated problem. Animal rights is not some sort of isolated problem. It's a problem of human rights as well. And you know, but anyway. Okay, any other questions? Any
Yeah,
other questions?
we have 2 more questions. I think these will be the last 2 questions. Unni, would you like
Okay.
to go ahead? Unni
Yeah.
and Renu, yeah.
Hello, Professor Gary. I'm sorry I can't turn on my video. So I just wanted to ask if veganism as a strategy for animal liberation, which means that liberating animals from being the status of property, if the strategy of veganism is effective enough, because it aims to, if I'm understanding it correctly, it aims to convert one person at a time into veganism, and therefore it cuts the supply, and it cuts the demand and therefore the supply, which paves way for sterilizing the existing animals, taking care of them until death, and ending domestication as such. But does not capitalistic market function by generating surplus demand and surplus supply in the first place, which in turn generates demand, and
Well,
in order to meet that demand, even more surplus supply is produced? So does not this go into a vicious cycle, and is it not unrealistic to expect people to realize the moral import of veganism and then convert? Does not the capitalistic production system decide their mental orientation in some way?
no. I think look, every society, whether it's capitalist, socialist, communist, agrarian, whatever, has exploited animals. As a matter of fact, you know, Marx said that the economic substructure determines the moral and legal superstructure. the way we treat animals is a refutation of Marx on that score, in that every society, irrespective of its economic system, has exploited animals. And if Marx was right that the economic substructure determines the moral superstructure, you would think that some of these economic substructures would generate a different result when it comes to animals. And the answer is it hasn't. They haven't. And so I don't think, I mean, capitalism is I don't like capitalism, but I think capitalism is bad for humans. It isn't necessarily bad for animals, in the sense that if we made a decision as capitalists that we didn't think animals should be commodities, then those that would be sort of removed from what could be commodified. The problem is we think animals are commodities, but we think animals are commodities whether we're in a capitalist system, whether we're in Cuba. Cuba was probably the closest we've had to a really socialistic system, more so than the Soviet Union. But there was plenty of animal exploitation in Cuba. And I'm talking about Cuba under Fidel. I mean, things have changed now, but Cuba under Fidel was pretty much a socialist system, but yet animals were commodified there. And so I don't think that, I have this argument. There's a guy named David Nybert, who's a friend of mine. As a matter of fact, I think David Nybert put something on the back of my book. Yes, he did. David Nybert. Yeah, he's a really good guy. And he always talks about capitalism being the culprit. Now I would say, David, if capitalism is the culprit, how do you explain Cuba? And so I don't think that capitalism is a bad system, but it's bad. It's not necessarily bad for animals. It is necessarily bad for humans. That I think is a problem, because even if it doesn't allow turning humans, even if we morally have rejected chattel slavery, there's still tremendous pressure to sort of devalue the human person. That's a problem with capitalism. I don't think it's necessarily a problem with animals. If we as capitalists, logically, could you have a capitalist system in which there was no animal exploitation? The answer is yes. Logically, could you have a capitalist system that didn't have alienation in terms of alienating workers from from the actual value of their labor? The answer is you can't, because that's what capitalism is. Capitalism necessarily involves alienation. Capitalism doesn't necessarily involve animal commodification. We're just in a system where animals are regarded as commodities, so they're going to be produced in a way that accords with their commodity status. So no, I don't. I think that, and now one thing you said that I want to go back to, and that is this business about you do it one vegan at a time. The answer is no. I mean, the only way you can do this, I mean, what are the alternatives? The alternatives are like doing what these animal groups do, these animal charities do. Let's make exploitation nicer, and so let's change the law and make it nicer, and all that doesn't do anything. First of all, those laws are generally worthless. Secondly, they're generally not enforced. Thirdly, what they generally tend to do is make people feel more comfortable by continuing to exploit animals. So they have no, in my judgment, they have no positive effect. What I'm saying in the book is that, look, there's a zillion people out there, and they all care about animals. And if the light went on and they realized that caring about animals, caring about your partner means you don't beat her up. Caring about animals means you don't eat them. And if the light went on and all of those people, stopped eating animals and stopped wearing them, we would have a revolution of the heart that would change society as we know it. I'm not going to live to see that, probably. Although I have been a vegan for almost 40 years, so I could, in theory, live to be 150. But I was thinking, this is my 30 in 2022. We're in 2020. Next year will be my 40th year as a vegan, and so I'm not going to live to see that to see the world, to see that revolution of the heart. I don't think, but we could have it. That's the sad thing, man. That's the sad thing. We could make it different if we wanted to. If we would engage in the collective action, there's so much we could do. And we have part of what neoliberalism has trained us to believe is that we're all sort of independent and we can't we can't get together anymore and collectively act. We can, we just don't do it, but we could if we wanted to. And that's a sad thing, is that we could make things very different. If we, all of us who cared about animals, I mean, I meet every day. If I had 5 cents for every time someone has said to me, "Oh, I really love animals," and I say, "Are you vegan?" I say, "No." "What do you mean am I vegan? That's extreme." and I always say to them, no, what's extreme is you love animals, but you continue to participate in their exploitation. That's what's extreme. That's what you need to think about. And if we would just look at this differently, we could change the world if we wanted to. Just like, look, in this country, we feed enough, the crops we feed in the United States, the animals that we're going to slaughter, we could feed 800 million people. So like, even if you don't care about animals, the issue is important. Food justice is important. If we all ate plants, there would be no starvation. There would be no world starvation. Because first of all, the number of acres under cultivation would go down. A friend of mine in Oxford, named Joseph Poor, has calculated that if we all became vegan, we would reduce the size of acreage under cultivation for crops by the size of Africa. So in other words, if we all ate plants, we wouldn't be growing more plants, we would be growing fewer plants, because right now we grow all these plants so we can feed to animals, so that we can eat the animals. 800 million people in this country alone. That's why I believe this is not just an animal rights issue. This is a fundamental issue of human justice. It's also a matter of survival, because the reality is this may all become completely academic in the worst sense of that word, in that global warming, which we're not going to stop. I mean, the idea that we're going to sort of come up with some magic bullet to stop global warming. Easiest way to stop global warming, if you had a 75 to 95% reduction in the consumption of animal products, you could stop it from getting warmer. So if all of us stopped, if 75 to 95% of us stopped eating animals altogether, no problem, we would actually survive. What's interesting to me is that we claim to be rational animals. Global warming and our continued consumption of animal products in the face of global warming, our continued consumption of animal products in the face of pandemics, all of which, or most of which, are zoonotic. They come from animals. They jump from animals to humans in contexts in which we're exploiting those animals. So the fact that we are like, we're talking to each other because I can't be in India right now because of the pandemic. I wouldn't go anyway because of the air, the problems with air travel, and the problems of what I'd see once I get there would probably throw me into deep depression. But the reality is I can't even in theory entertain that because of the pandemic. Life has changed because of this damn pandemic. And the pandemic, I mean, we don't know exactly where it came from. Maybe it came from a lab in Wuhan. Maybe it came from, bats, giving it to pangolins and people eating pangolins. But the bottom line is most pandemics are zoonotic. In the face of zoonotic illnesses, which will wipe us out at some point, and in the face of global warming, we continue to eat animal products. It is just remarkable to me that we think of ourselves as rational animals. I don't think we're rational at all. All right. Any other questions?
We just have one more question. Renu?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi, Zine.
Hello, everyone. Uh, Thank you, Gary. My question, I am really curious to know your opinions about the practice of human people where they engage their companion animals in the internet. They create Instagram, Facebook pages for their pets. They share photos and videos. Basically, animals are being treated as family, as companions with compassion, and they're also given personhood, but they're also being used as fetish, as a property for entertainment. What do you think about that, please?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends. If somebody's just posting pictures of their dogs or cats or whatever, I don't really see that as necessarily anything different from people who do that with their children. I mean, there are people who the people have Facebook pages and they've got like 1 million pictures of their children. And people have Facebook pages where they have 1 million pictures of their dogs. And we tend to, those of us who regard our non-human animals as members of our family, sort of tend to think of them as, I don't know, I mean, not as children per se, but we tend to have these sorts of, we tend to think of them in somewhat the same way. Now, there are pages where people are sort of like doing things with like, teaching the dogs tricks and stuff like that, or whatever. That's a little bit different. But I don't know that I mean, we only fetishize. The only reason why we can use that word to fetishize in that context is because we don't regard other animals as non-human persons, and so we just treat some as special, that we invest a certain amount of emotional energy in, and so we fetishize them. But I mean, I don't think, as I say, I think domestication is wrong. I think it's just a bad idea, because I think the idea of bringing submissive and subservient beings into existence, the whole purpose of which, that they exist so you can control. I mean, the reason why they're bred the way they're bred is to make them subservient. A good dog is one who obeys you, right? And so, that to me is problematic, and we got to stop that. But I also believe that they're like, I sort of think of my dogs as non-human refugees. They need a place to live. Someone's got to take care of them. You can't let them go. They'll get run over by cars and stuff like that. And they're wonderful little beings. They're great. They've got great emotional depth and stuff like that. And that we ought to take care of them. But it doesn't surprise me that people post pictures of them on the internet, because they sort of think of them as kids, and I understand that, because, that's how we relate to them. I don't have human children. I made it, when my partner and I got together many years ago, we thought the world was too weird then to bring more children into existence. And it wasn't even nearly as weird as, I mean, if you had told me, when we got together, that one day Donald Trump would be president, I'd say, oh, no. That could never happen. Not only did he become president, but 74 million people voted for him the last time. After 4 years of him, 74 million people said, let's have another 4 years, which scares the hell out of me. But things are are not going in a good direction. And so we didn't have children because we thought the world was going in a bad direction. And we thought, why bring children into existence? If you're going to have children, adopt them for the same reason. You go and you adopt them. There are children who don't have homes. Why do you want to make children when there are children who need homes? And, the answer you get is nonsense. It's my child, as only if it's got my blood. Love is not a matter of blood relationships. Love is a matter of something else. And matter of your atma, your spirit, it is not a matter of blood. And so I always thought, well, you should adopt. You shouldn't have biological children. It makes no sense. There's already too many people on the planet anyway. And so I don't know how I would relate to a biological child. But I mean, when my dogs die, I go into great grief. I suffer greatly. Now, what I tend to do basically is when one dies, I tend to go to the shelter immediately and say, okay, let me take another one, because I sort of think that's what the dog who died would want me to do, although that's obviously anthropomorphizing. But I sort of, I never thought I would ever have 5, let alone 7. And once I get situated, when we get moved to where we're going to move, I'll have more than 5, many more than 5. So I, now I don't post pictures of my dogs on the internet that I remember doing. But I don't think there'd be anything wrong if I certainly.
I think your Wikipedia page has a picture of you with your dog, if I remember correctly.
Oh yeah, I know, but that's I don't, I was actually thinking about replacing that picture, because first of all, it's like 30 years old. And you know, I mean, you know, and I hate, I don't like, I don't, um, it's an old picture. But secondly, I don't like, you know, it's like, I'm sitting there with my dogs, you know, I mean, it's like, I don't, I mean, but it's funny. I was thinking this morning, I should, you know, how do you replace pictures on Wikipedia? Can the person who's the subject of it do it? Because I didn't, anyway, that's a whole other question. And I'll ask one of my students, all of whom know more about this technical stuff than I do. And so, uh, but I don't tend to post pictures of them on my Facebook page. I actually don't post anything about myself personally. My Facebook page is only to talk about the issues. I don't talk about, I never post pictures of me, or, you know, me at restaurants, or me at the, you know, me with friends, or me, you know, whatever. And I generally don't do that. And and so, but anyway, I hope I answered your question. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, I'm quick question. I'm also curious
Yeah.
about the idea of celebrity animals, animal influencers, because after the cat got famous, we have a lot of people beginning to adopt cats all over the world. So, what is your take on that? Thank you.
Well, look, I think everybody will adopt. I think we ought, you know, they're in this mess because of us. And so I think we ought to adopt them. You know, I mean, so I think it's fine to adopt. I mean, the problem is continuing to think about them as commodities. And that's the problem. And making it a trend, you know, so that like some movie comes out with Dalmatians, some Walt Disney movie comes out with Dalmatians, and then people want to, you know, adopt Dalmatians, or they want to get Dalmatians, so that, you know, so then there's a run on breeding of Dalmatians. You know, that sort of stuff I think is a problem. But you know, I don't think, you know, I mean, look, when you say one of the expressions you use, which I thought was interesting, you said celebrate animals. I have to tell you something. I did not grow up with animals. My brother was asthmatic, and my parents would not allow us to have animals in the house. And so I didn't ever had a dog or cat or whatever growing up. And indeed, I probably, you know, I always thought, you know, because my parents, you know, were so strict about this. They didn't want any dander in the house, or, you know, and they would never allow, if one of our friends had a dog, they couldn't come in the house, etc., with the dog. And so it was only when I got together with my partner, and she wanted to have a dog, and I quickly realized that if I did not go along with that, I wasn't going to have that partner. And so I said, okay, fine, you want a dog, get a dog. And I remember being very uncomfortable when we got our first dog. And I was very uncomfortable having a dog in the house. And now when I look at it, I view the dogs as the most important. I mean, I learned so much from them. And what I've learned from them is these are beings who do not have egos, but who love. And I think that is remarkable. They don't have egos. They are self-aware. I have no doubt about that. I think, you know, Peter's wrong about that. Tom was wrong about that. Everybody who thinks that animals are not self-aware, particularly, I mean, dogs, to say that a dog is not self-aware is, in my judgment, as crazy as saying a dog doesn't have a tail. Of course they've got tails. Of course they're self-aware. They're self-aware. That's clear. And but they don't have egos. That is the difference. So they are beings who are self-aware, but not self-aware in an egotistical way. And I find that to be a form of life which is in many ways amazing. And I like nothing more than my idea of a good time is hanging around with the dogs, watching a movie or something like that, and everybody's in a pile, which is how we, you know, it's like all of our dogs get along. They always have. We've never had problems with our packs with dogs fighting ever. even though we adopt dogs that have had very bad backgrounds, we adopt abused dogs. Four of our dogs now are abuse cases. One was born in a puppy. One was born from a mother who was rescued from a puppy mill, which is a big industrial production of puppies. The day she was born, the day after the mother was rescued from the puppy. The other four are cruelty cases. And everybody gets along. They all sleep on the bed. One of them is blind and deaf. We have a very big bed, and you know, that's my idea of a good time. But they are. I celebrate them. I don't think I fetishize them, in the sense that I don't. They're not humans, but they are complex beings who have great emotional depth and, in my judgment, great integrity as beings. And the idea that we think of them as inferior to us, I find both sad and funny at the same time, that we think that they're, you know, I look at my dogs and then I say, you know, I look at my dogs and then I look at the world. The world is created by humans, mostly men. And I laugh when I hear people say animals are inferior. They don't create bombs. They don't torture each other. They don't harm each other for nothing, you know, so that they can have a few more toys to play with. They just don't do that. And I think in many ways they're a superior form of life. But anyway. All right. Well, if that's the last question, I'm happy to take more, but she's calling the shots here. And so, you know,
I think that's about
anyway.
it, Gary. Thanks a
All
lot.
right, that's fine.
Thanks a lot for coming to talk with us, for spending part of your morning with us. I didn't get to hear about your dogs the last time. It was great to hear about them and hear you speak about them too.
Yeah. Well, I hope you all have I love the cover of this book. The woman
Yeah,
who
it's
designed it,
really
she did a great.
nice.
I think she did a great job. But anyway, well, I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions, you can send me an email. She's got my email address. Susan's got my email address. I try to answer everything. You know, I can't. I get zillions of emails every week. It's insane. But I try to answer, particularly if I've done a thing where I've spoken with people. But you know, so if you send me an email, just put, you know, friend of Susan Harris or something, you know, and that way you know, it'll trigger my increasingly aging brain. But anyway, all right, you all take care, be well. And if you're not vegan, go vegan. If you are vegan, stay vegan. All right, be well.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, Gary. Thank you so much for being here with us. Yeah. And thank you, everybody else, for joining us today. If you join our Google group, as I think most of you have done, we will keep you informed about what's coming up next. We will have other events happening. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.